Is this fine group of young students?
So you are all in for a treat tonight. This is the on-air group. They'll explain who they are and what they're doing here. Whenever we have a board meeting and we have children here, it kind of livens it up in a nice way. We have other things going on the agenda, but we're starting with on-air. And I'd like to introduce Mike Rocco, who will begin the presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for your time and service. We feel really privileged to present our project to you tonight. I'm Mike Rocco, and I'm the director for On Air.
That's Amherst Investigative Reporters.
We are independent producers for SAU-39's digital magazine called
One School Street!
Is it better to give than to receive? Can being a giver correlate to becoming successful? If we give of ourselves with no strings attached, how will that affect us? Will it make others happy? Will it make us happy? The answer is, of course, yes. So how do you want to give? Those were the questions posed to 3 young girls living in Amherst, New Hampshire, when asked how they wanted to give back to their schools and community. Maddie Daniel, Julia Daniel, and Heather Skinner decided they would all work on a long-term giving project. Ask not what your school system can do for you, ask what you can do for your school system. This is Heather Skinner. Maddie Daniel and Julia Daniel cannot be with us tonight. We also have Paris Dezen, Nathaniel Shepard, Katie Helgerson, Noah Fillion, Cody Lund, Jenna Wright, Tim Johnson, and our editor Jake Horhold, who could not be here with us tonight. And many of the kids could not make it here tonight due to prior commitments. The Girls Project began as a kids' comedy cable news show about 3 investigative girl reporters hired by a greedy boss, played by Paris Dezen, to cover school events, all the while trying to find Bigfoot, to save him from the greedy boss. Funny. So now what? They contacted John Ranta from Sauhegan's broadcasting club called Sabercast Studios and asked him if the broadcasting club could help these children produce this program. And that's how I got involved. I am the director of the broadcasting club, and I have been a part of it since my freshman year. I'm also part of the tech and social media committees with the Sauhegan High School Ethics Forum, and I've designed their website with a friend of mine, Tim Johnson. And I also run the radio club. So this project was right up my alley, and I knew immediately that I had to get involved. But how do we connect to the community? We were really stuck. But then came along Peter Warburton, a superintendent who enjoys a great reputation in the state of New Hampshire and who is an ambassador for the creative arts. Peter could not have stepped in at a better time. We had something fantastic, but we needed a mentor for getting our footage out to the public. And Peter spoke of the Connect pillar of the SAU-39 strategic plan. Peter was really generous with his time and knew that we needed to stay independent for our ideas to flourish. But we would need someone to help us to connect to the community. Little did I know, as the project grew to the middle school and Clark Wilkins, and now to Mount Vernon Village School, that we would embark on a journey that would lead us to producing for SAU-39's digital magazine called
One School Street!
So we have special gifts tonight as a way of saying thank you for your time and support. We have a group photo of our superintendent, Peter Warburton, Sauhegan Principal Rob Scully, Clark Wilkins Principal Jerry Saint Armand, and our Director of Curriculum, Christine Landworld. We have snippets to show you tonight of taped interviews with many of the people, including 6 kindergarten teachers for a piece about full-day kindergarten. I just wanted to say that I was really personally moved after I filmed the full-day kindergarten teachers talking about all the difficulties that they had in the past with half-day kindergarten and all the ways that they are now able to interact with the kids and the really great benefits that full day gives to them. I can honestly say I wasn't aware of the issues, and I'm so glad that Amherst provides full day kindergarten, so thanks so much for making that happen. In the future, look for our investigative reporters working undercover, disguised as senior citizens, chasing down Porter Dodge at the middle school, interviewing Mary Lou Mullins regarding what makes a good school board, John Schuttinger, principal of Mount Vernon School, as our singing mad scientist for their spring musical, Christopher Brooks at the Ethics Forum at Sauhegan, and Julia Daniels' article, Play, 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 where she covers the middle school, high school, and PTA plays. We have John Ranta, Bethany Bernasconi, Lisa Femiahu, Robert Aldwarden, and Adam Theriault on our calendar to interview also. Watch out, we might be coming for you next. So enjoy the video.
Are you Rob Scully? You're not Rob Scully.
No.
You're not Principal Scully of Sauhegan High School in Amherst, New Hampshire?
Oh. That Rob Scully, yeah,
We're on air. Amherst investigative reporters. We are independent producers for SAU-39's digital magazine called One School Street. Have you been working in multiple roles at Sauhegan High School for the past 14 years?
Yes, I have.
Did you teach 9th grade English?
I did.
Were you also athletic coach?
Yes,
Were you also an advisor?
I was.
Are you now, or have you ever been an active member of the community council?
Yes,
Are you now, or have you ever been an active member of personal policy committee?
absolutely.
Have you now, or ever been a grade 9 team captain?
I was that.
Are you now, or have you ever been a dean of students at the high school?
Yes, I was.
Do you have a Bachelor of Arts in English teaching?
Yes,
Do you have a Master's in Education Leadership from UNH?
I do.
Did you finish your Certificate of Advanced Graduate Studies with a concentration in Education Specialist in Administration and Supervision from UNH?
I did.
What's this we hear about the White House contacting you?
You heard. Contacted us because of the great work, really the entire district's doing, but the high school has been involved in putting together a better, fairer way to assess students. And basically what that means is redesign curriculum, redesign learning experiences, and instead at the end of them, just sit and have you do a bubble-in exam. We provide performance tasks or performance assessments. So, believe it or not, the state of New Hampshire and the Department of Education is at the forefront of some amazing work, and Sauhegan has been a lead school in that work. So much so that earlier this year, we were contacted by the White House and representatives from Souhegan on behalf of SAU-39 attended a White House convening on better, fairer tests.
Are you sure?
If you're listening, Souhegan and the entire SAU is involved in something called PACE. And PACE is an initiative, performance assessments for competency education, that create learning experiences for students that are much more valid, authentic, and meaningful. So of course I'm sure.
Are you sure you're sure?
Oh my gosh, I thought you guys were reporters. Did you pay attention? I'm so sure that if you went into our school right now, you would see tests or experiences where our students, not only did our teachers go to the White House, but we have students from one of our journalism classes attending the inauguration because of the work they're doing in journalism class. You might have heard of the Hype Forum. 1,500 students from all over New England attend a Souhegan student-led workshop where they discuss an essential question and share ideas in a philosophical setting. So yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Are you sure you're sure?
Yeah, I'm really, really sure. And I'm so sure that not only is Souhegan involved in this kind of work, but schools in the entire district are working on their curriculum and their assessments and their student experiences that are going to make SAU-39 one of the best districts in the entire state of New Hampshire.
Hey kid,
Yeah.
gotta go.
On air, Amherst investigative reporters, Clark teacher interview, take one.
Action.
Welcome to On Air. That's Amherst Investigative Reporters. Your independent producers for SAU-39 Digital Magazine called One School Street. Last year, Principal Jerry St. Amand, Superintendent Peter Warburton, and other school administrators were successful in installing full day kindergarten with no impact on the school budget. The goal was improving education. We are talking with principals and full day
thank you guys so much for letting us present. That's just a taste of what we've been doing, what we're going to be doing in the future. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.
So stay tuned. This is, again, with our Connect Committee. We're trying with their help. And what a great bunch of kids, huh? There's a lot more with this group. To get us lots of snapshots, so a lot of links on the magazine will be to these videos and many more. To have our public see a lot of the great things that are happening in our schools. We have some Mount Vernon kids in some other videos. We have just met with John Schuttinger in Mount Vernon. We have some students that will be starting with this group very soon. Sarah Skinner doesn't want anybody to point to her and say she's part of this, but she's the one holding the camera. Has a lot of background in TV and everything else. So thank you, Sarah, very much for all you do. So.
Thank you for your school system and all of your work. Because we have a dynamite school system. Are we going to be able to get a group photo?
Oh, so I'm going to ask you to bear with me just for a second. So in front of the screen, if we could all go up in front of the screen, Sarah would like a picture of the board, all of us and myself, and I'm going to ask Christine and Meg to come up, and I'm going to let you lead the picture. So could we all move in front of the screen just for a second?
This will be for the digital magazine.
Yep.
Okay. Do they want to be part of
Kim
it?
comes just for the photo op.
You know it. At least to make sure you know I
Should arrange everyone. Now stay back a little bit because they'll arrange themselves quickly. You're tall. Sorry. So we just need some of the taller guys in the back a little bit.
Yeah, they're coming.
So Adam, Jim, David, Peter, if you can get more in the back.
Behind the screen.
I'm tall. So you guys get right on the side there. I want either side of Mike there. Here. So what we're going to do is we're going to now squish in. So you're going to switch places with him. Peter, you're going to be like right here. Yep. Yes, sideways. Can you get in a little bit behind this spot? Right here. Like I would be you. I would be like just like that. Oh, can we have this light off? It is really bright. It's It's running right across their faces. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So this gentleman, we don't see you at all.
You're welcome.
And when we do crop this stuff, this sides, they tend to get cut off, especially when we're trying to do some pictures. One more. Everyone squish just a little bit. Squish, 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 squish. One more squish.
I know.
I think this is going to be it. We're really close for it. Yeah. Nice energy. One School Street! Do it for the kids with your right hand. One School Street. It's for the magazine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, all right.
Left, right.
Hi, Paul. I'm just going to wait.
I have a team to point.
All right.
I don't know. So I control it. With what? Just
Here, please. This shows you what's next.
okay.
Yeah. Come on.
Okay, we'll continue on with the board reports. Sahegan, Mary Lou.
So we just met actually this past Monday and voted on our budget. We started off with an almost $1 million increase because of special education costs, transportation costs, vocational, retirement, and health care. And we reduced it by about $575,000 or so to get it down to a 2% increase, and those who were at the public hearing know that. We met after the public hearing, and then again this past Monday, voted, and all of the articles passed to be put on the warrants, and 7-0 in favor, but our budget, actually proposed budget, was 5-2, so that's what will be on our warrant articles. And I think that's been our biggest focus. I don't know if anybody else has anything else to add. No? Okay.
Thank you. Amherst School Board.
We also had our, is this not working?
No.
Oh, we also had our public hearing. Similar to Sauhegan, we had some large increases to deal with in healthcare costs, retirement, and special education. We were able to work hard on our budget and have it decrease it significantly, and it's actually below our default budget. We concluded our negotiations with the Amherst Education Association, and we were not able to come to an agreement on a contract. And all of this was presented at the public hearing. And I think that's it. We voted on our budget and on the one warrant article that we have, which is for an increase in, or a contribution to the special education reserve, should there be a surplus in funds, and both the budget warrant article and the special education warrant article passed unanimously by the board. And we look forward to the deliberative next month.
Howard, can I add, just because we heard also from our Advisory Finance Committee, who voted in favor 7-0 of our budget and all the other articles except for our PPC negotiations. I think I brought that up last time at the SAU meeting, but we also negotiated this year, came to a one-year agreement, and the board again voted in favor of it. The Advisory Finance Committee was 6-1 in favor of that warrant.
All right, thank you. Now Mount Vernon, Tom.
So likewise, we had our public hearing as well. Overall, our budget, proposed budget, is up slightly from last year, less than 25,000 in that range. And it is lower than our default as well. Additionally, we have a couple of warrant articles, continue our building maintenance fund. We're establishing a fund for unanticipated tuition costs by retiring one fund and transferring the funds into that. And then we're continuing to fund our special education fund as well. So all those were put on the ballot, were unanimous.
Great, thank you. Do we have any comments from the public? Okay, seeing no public comments, we'll go on to the consent agenda. Does anybody want anything pulled from the consent agenda?
I just have a question when it comes to voting. I came in partway through. Should I abstain? Because I wasn't here for the beginning part of the
Steve?
minutes.
Do whatever you want.
Okay.
And unless you pull minutes, I can't vote on anything else because I have to abstain.
So seeing nobody wants to pull anything, would anybody like to make a motion?
Under the roll call for 107, there was some no's in here. I think those people were present. It should be NAs, not Ns.
I did have a question.
Yeah, I
I
saw
don't
that.
remember that Mary Lou saying no to the roll call.
No, I was absent, so like Dwayne said,
Yeah.
maybe it should be,
NA.
It's in NA in the second table, but in the first one it shows up.
All right,
as
let's pull the minutes from this package.
Yep.
And can I have a motion to accept the rest of it?
I'll make a motion to accept the rest of the consent agenda.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second.
Paul? Okay, any questions before we vote? Okay, everybody in favor? Anybody abstaining? Okay, any noes? Okay, they pass, unanimous. Okay, for the minutes, let's have the,
Yeah, those of you that are here, if you could help me with those, I'm looking at the roll call to exit non-public, is that right, on 134?
yeah,
To enter.
So if you could help me with what that,
I thought it was to enter.
you have to enter non-public.
To enter non-public.
okay,
Yeah, the ends should be NA.
I'm sorry?
Every N should be NA.
Got it. Okay,
that's the end, yeah.
yep,
Okay,
yep.
do we just table those then? No,
Yep,
next.
we'll table until next time.
Okay, these will be included back in the next month's agenda.
Sarah's not here.
Okay, special education review.
Howard, don't we have to vote on the minutes?
As amended.
Oh, you're tabling them, I'm sorry. I
We'll just
thought we
table them
did
until
one.
next,
Okay,
they'll be in the
sorry.
next month's agenda.
So you all know there was well, you may know, there was a request from a citizen about looking at other towns' special ed costs and special ed programs. I think Hollis and Brookline were mentioned. I've asked Meg to put a presentation together to talk about some foundational pieces before we get into the other piece. And I think also I want you to know that Meg will come back to the April meeting to continue to talk about these pieces. And I had in my notes to you that we're also planning a roundtable for the community about special ed and special ed costs. And we don't have a date yet, but we'll have that pretty soon. So Meg, thank you very much.
And just for the record, next month, I want to present in my car, too, the
Yeah.
way Rob did, because that looks like a lot more fun.
Can I get in the back seat?
So yes, we had, as we typically do through the budget process, questions come up with regard to special education, and we, sort of break apart, and we have subcommittees, and I meet with various folks, and we seem to have some of the same questions come up year after year, so I thought it might be a good idea to start by just providing a basic overview. I apologize to those of you who already know a lot of this stuff, but knowing your audience is a good idea, and I'm not sure that everybody does, so I'll try and make it brief. I know you have a really packed agenda. In addition to the overview with regard to some of the special education laws and the entitlements that go along with those, I wanted you all to be aware that as part of my daily practice, I sit on both the Regional Directors Board and the State Directors Board, and so we meet at least monthly, along with some subcommittee work, to determine both regionally, we're in the South Central region, and statewide, what other folks are doing in terms of best practice with regard to special education. We share ideas. If somebody's doing it better, I'm always open to hearing about that. So that being said, please feel free to stop me if you have any specific questions about any of this. There are currently, with regard to school districts, 3 major categories of law that protect individuals who have some type of disability. The Individuals with Disability Education Act, which was reauthorized in 2004, which you have probably heard of, referred to as IDEA. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that was passed in 1973. Section 504 of that, it's a civil rights statute, but the Section 504 of that civil rights statute pertains specifically to education and educational environments, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act. Typically, in the public school system, this is sort of the hierarchy in terms of order with regard to how we look at categories of disability and whether or not students meet criteria for those. So you have your overarching general student population. That's everybody that walks into our door. From there, you may have a percentage of that population that meets criteria and is eligible for what we call a 504 plan. And then a smaller population still would be your students who might be eligible for IDEA services. Those are your special education services and supports that we provide through individualized education plans. When we look at IDEA, we are talking about children who are identified, and so they are entitled to what we call a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. They're entitled to special education and related services that are provided at no expense to them or to their parents. That's IDEA. There are 13 different categories of disability under IDEA. The 13 are listed here. The important thing to be aware of with regard to how we identify these, the state and the federal government set forth really specific criteria that we have to follow. There are very specific standardized assessments that we need to give with regard to identifying kiddos with these types of disabilities. They have to be identified with the disability, and then there's a second prong there. Once they're identified, they have to require specialized instruction, special education, or related services. That's something that's different from the general ed curriculum. Okay. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is a little bit less discriminatory. This prohibits school districts or any other public entity who takes public or federal funds from discriminating based on disability. It's an equal access law, and what I mean by that is that if somebody is identified with a disability but they don't need special education, they might just need some general classroom accommodations or building accommodations, a ramp to get inside, things like that. To be eligible to be identified under 504, the student must have a disability that substantially limits their participation in or access to school programs. It does not have to be one of the 13 categories of disability under IDEA. So an example of that might be a student who has a diagnosed anxiety disorder. They might require some more frequent classroom breaks. That's a basic classroom accommodation that we can provide for them on a 504 plan. They don't need altered curriculum, they don't need special education or related services.
At what age do they age out of the idea?
IDEA?
Yeah.
21. 21. I think I just did this one. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah?
I was gonna ask, can you explain the difference between the 504 or an IEP? Or
Yeah.
is it the same thing or?
Nope. So a 504 plan is not an IEP. A 504 plan doesn't have special education services, doesn't have altered curriculum, doesn't typically have related services attached to it. A 504 plan would just be a plan that outlines some basic classroom or building level accommodations that a student might need, like the student who might have the anxiety disorder. They may need to be allowed, so a classroom teacher doesn't let any child just get up and walk out of class and take a break. But if you have an anxiety disorder, you might have a 504 plan that says you may get up and walk out of class and take a break. Because if your anxiety is getting the best of you and you need to take that break in order to be able to come back in and then access your curriculum, that's allowable. That's just a classroom accommodation. Does that clarify that for you? Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about IDEA and kiddos who are eligible for special education and related services, and how both the state and federal government, as well as public school districts, sort of keep our thumb on top of where we're performing. They have things called performance indicators that are outlined under Part B of IDEA. There used to be 20 some odd performance indicators. They're down to about 16 right now. They range from looking at what our percentage of identified population is that graduates from high school with a regular ed diploma. They look at how we transition 2.5 to 3-year-olds out of early supports and services and into our special education programs. They look at whether or not we meet evaluation timelines in a timely way. We have 45 days to complete an evaluation. So they look at a variety of different things. Knowing that I had a limited amount of time tonight, I really wanted to focus on indicator number 5, which talks about least restrictive environment. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this is because this sort of impacts and threads through what we do with every single student every single day. And it's interesting, you asked, about aging out at 21. Some students stay with us till they're 21. We could theoretically get a child at 2.5 years old who transitions into our 3-year-old preschool program, for example. And we could be working with that child and that family until they are 21 years old. That is a long time. That is a long time to be working to support a family, to be working to support a child. And indicator 5 goes a long way in terms of helping us to create a very positive working relationship with families and with children, and maintaining the fabric of that relationship over really what spans 19 years. So indicator 5 is what I want to talk a little bit more about tonight. So indicator 5 again is the least restrictive environment, and it tells us that students who are eligible for special education and related services have to the best of our ability, be educated with students who are not disabled. We absolutely have to, by law, consider regular ed classrooms first. And if that means, or that requires, supplementary aids, supports, or services that allow those children to be successful within the regular ed classroom, then we need to do it. And we need to consider those things before we consider pulling that child out of the regular ed classroom at any time. That's their right. And that's what indicator 5 really looks at.
Okay. Is it okay if I just add one thing? When we were going over the special ed budget, I had always asked, when the special ed students are included in the regular class, I always ask for some kind of proof, like where is the data that shows this is the best way to educate them? Are they really getting the benefit from this? And basically the answer was, we can't even track data like that because of this law. So even if it is better educationally for the student to get educated in a separate environment, they can't do it, even if it's better for the child, because this law says they have to be in the least restrictive environment.
Well, the measure is always FAPE, that free, appropriate public education that they are allowed to be able to have access to, and whether or not we can put supports and services in place in the regular ed environment to be able to allow for that to happen. So in the state of New Hampshire, indicator 5 is broken apart into 3 different sections, A, B, and C. They look at what percentage of our student population spends 80% or more of their day in the regular ed classroom. They look at what percentage of our student population spends less than 40% of their day in the regular classroom. And then they look at the completely separate category, which is what percentage of your student population is in out-of-district placements, separate facilities, residential facilities, homebound instruction, or hospital placements. Here's where it gets fascinating. You're all riveted. When I took a deeper dig into some of the neighborhood districts with regard to Indicator 5, to take a look at what percentage of their students as compared to our students were spending 80% or more in the regular ed classroom, I noticed that we were doing a little bit better than some of our neighborhood districts. And Pete's right, when we sat and talked about what different things that we could look at to see whether or not inclusion was better, one of the things that I know, and one of the things that we talk about almost at every single budget meeting I've ever attended, is those out-of-district costs, the costs that are attached to kiddos when we have been unable to or unsuccessful with meeting their needs within the school district. This is Part B, which is the percentage of students in the regular ed class less than 40% of their school day. Now, I want you to be aware that this could be students who are participating in self-contained programs. I know that in Amherst, we've talked about, and we are going to move forward with creating an in-district self-contained program. That's to cut down on some potential out-of-district costs that we might have. So while these percentages, Conval's at 14.5%, Amherst is only at 0.79%. In order to keep our out-of-district costs down, we may need to go up a little bit in this category. But right now, this is the way we look comparatively to other neighboring school districts. And then last but not least, these are your out-of-district percentages. Now, when I talked about the fabric of the relationships that we have with parents over an extended period of time, that relationship helps significantly with ultimately what could end up being your out-of-district costs. If you get to a point with a family where they're thinking that you can't do it, or the trust is gone, then you may be looking at an out-of-district program. I like to let you all know that we don't use out-of-district programs unless the school district agrees that it's appropriate. Other districts I know get caught in litigation cases that are lost, and they end up with a court-ordered out-of-district placement, one that a hearing officer will order. I don't want to be there.
Can I ask one more? I hope I don't embarrass myself by asking this question, but I don't think your three numbers added up to 100%.
No.
So something didn't make sense to me.
Right, and so there's always a percentage of students who aren't reported out on for one reason or another. And it could be, it could be that that somebody in Nessus didn't create their data correctly. But this is the data that the Department of Ed has in the database to be able to pull from. And I can't tell you why. What I can tell you, though, is that greater capacity in district to fully include our kids and to hang on to our kids creates much lower costs with regard to out-of-district placements. And in today's day and age, when one out-of-district placement could be a $200,000 a year price tag, those are the numbers that I would like to see. I'd like to even see them go down.
So we don't have any out of district that are court ordered?
No, sir.
And the out-of-district costs just went up 10% this year.
Yes.
So that, yeah, for next year.
So that was what I wanted to leave you with tonight. Doing an overview of special education is sort of like sitting down with somebody for 10 minutes and talking about war and peace. It's just so, there's so much information involved with special education. So I tried to pick some of the points that were coming up through budget conversations and focus on that tonight. Any other questions?
So Meg, speaking of budgets and proposed budgets, for the operating budget for the Amherst School District, you proposed a increase of adding staff, and I want you to keep me honest here, make sure I got it right, increasing of adding staff because that would allow us to take, instead of having to go outside the district for services, would allow us to bring the students in as you mentioned briefly here. And I was wondering if you could talk to us briefly or mention briefly how over time, what your conservative estimate is for savings in the first, at least in the first year, based on that.
Yeah. So when we work to put together a budget, we do exactly that. We sort of take a look at a variety of different accounts. I know that has been incredibly frustrating to the budget advisory committees because the accounts seem to shift and change. But some of the things that we look at are the related services accounts. We had in Amherst a considerable bump, I would say, not just in our autistic population, but we're starting to see children who have survived, being really significant preemies, so they're neurologically compromised. I would say that we're starting to see some children who are neurologically compromised as a result of the opioid epidemic. Those children are starting to hit our public school systems. As that happens, we are having to put in services. In particular, we're spending a lot of services around behavior plans, supporting autistic children through board-certified behavior analysts, things like that. When we looked at our elementary population and a core group of children who are starting to shift towards the middle school, and I looked at the costs that we were paying for outside contracted providers in the categories of occupational therapy specifically and BCBA, or the Board Certified Behavior Analyst category, it looked more cost effective to create an in-district self-contained program that would do a couple of different things. It would allow us to hang on to those children instead of, what happens is that the older they get, the wider the gap gets with the Common Core curriculum and the capacity that those children have to be able to sort of access that. So they need some substantially altered different curriculum for the majority of their day. If we can't provide that in district, we need to find an out-of-district program that can. So I looked at that, we looked at that collectively at the middle school and decided to turn in some of the contracted services that we're paying for, which were pretty cost exorbitant, I would say, and hire our own in-district BCBA who could work with all of our children who have that need, hire our own on-staff occupational therapist who could work with all of our children, and create an in-district capacity to be able to hang on to some of those very compromised children instead of ultimately having to find an out-of-district placement for them.
So, as I understand that there was an overall cost savings associated with that, particularly when, and if I heard you right, and again, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that the consulting costs were going up at a much higher proportion than what would end up being the, say, this ongoing salary increases that would go over time.
That's exactly right.
So what you end up with is saving money, not only right off the bat, but even over time, the way the industry is going, that we'd end up saving more and more as we go forward if we keep in the current trend. Is that correct?
Right. Just OT contracted services alone were scheduled to increase by 3%. BCBA services have been, on average, increasing 2% a year. So those cost savings alone hiring your own in-district staff. You don't have those similar types of increases. And then there's the out-of-district tuition that was bumped 10%, and that's set by the State Department of Ed. We don't have any control over those things, so it seems like just common sense to use those placements as little as we can.
So this is educating, to me at least, but part of, I think, the underlying reason why we wanted to look into this was that we were hearing reports from other school districts who are doing more with less staff. So how do we fit into that group?
Well, one of the things that I've always said with regard to kind of making those types of blanket statements is that everything that we do, every contracted service that we pay for goes directly back to an IEP. I literally sit and count hours, half-hour units of PT, OT, speech for every student in every district. One significantly neurologically impaired child could cost a school district a significant amount of money, whether they're an in-district child or an out-of-district child. You can't, if I took 10 children right now at Sohegan High School, 5 and 5, all 10 are in IEPs, and I'd compare the cost of educating these 5 with the cost of educating these 5, there's no way to do a side-by-side comparison of those costs. There's no way for me to know, that in Hollis Brookline, say they have 10 paraprofessionals working with their children, and I have 14. 13 of my 14 might be one-to-one paraprofessionals who are attached to very significantly impaired children who, without those supports and services, would be out of district. But I can't tell you who Hollis Brooklines are attached to. So there really isn't a very accurate way. I will tell you that we had conversations about, why can't they kind of all be in one spot and you provide services for them there? Well, let's go back to the least restrictive, continuum. If I did that, you are bright people. There isn't a parent in Amherst who wouldn't know that their child has a right not to be in a room with a bunch of identified children. They have a right to be fully included and to access the same curriculum that everybody else can access. I'd be in Concord in due process hearings more than I'd be on School Street. It wouldn't be cost effective because it'd be in due process, you'd lose, and those figures would be a lot higher.
Any other question?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a question or more of a comment. I mean, I've been looking at special ed and from a district standpoint since, well, Kathy Skoglund, Renee, and now you, Meg. And I certainly support the inclusionness.
They were better than me.
No. And certainly support it from an inclusionness. The only thing, Paul, I will say, based on the comment about bringing something in and the understanding of that you're out of pocket expenses for an occupational therapist or something like that, is going to depend on the number of students that need the services. If those students are in middle school and are aging out in 6 or 8 years, there may not be the need to it. So it's not always consistent to say, in Mount Vernon, we probably can't do that based on our population from a number standpoint to do it. There has to be some sort of contracted services based on the students. So
That's
I wonder, true. Meg, in following up on that, and not something that you have to do tonight because I really appreciate that, but based on the student population going down, are we seeing that their need is higher for that to bring that in? Because we're bringing a person in and then now you're paying for benefits as well, and there's a lot more to it than a contracted service. Whereas if at some point you have more students at Sohegan and they would be aging out, that maybe you'd be phasing out people as opposed to there being a need for more. And again, no need to, we can discuss it at a later time. I just thought there should be a point well taken that it's not always the best case, and it probably is the best case based on my supporting what you've done in the past on the special ed budget, that it works for Amherst at this point. I'm
Right.
just not sure it always will.
You're absolutely right, and special education, I was telling Peter before the meeting started, the special education budgets and the staff and the services that we provide, it's a little bit like you have to watch it constantly. It's a little bit like building a sandcastle, turning your back, and then you turn back around, oh, it's all back to beach. You cannot do that with regard to special education. You have to constantly watch it and wait until you're at critical mass, like at Amherst Middle School, when the cost for the contracted services, all right, now I could hire my own, and it would be much cheaper. You're right, Mount Vernon is a tricky little district, and not that I would plug for.
These numbers you have, Meg, these numbers you have right now are for this year, right?
These are, so the Department of Education gave us these figures last spring, and these are from 14-15, and then this spring we'll get 15-16.
Do they go back in time also?
Yes.
So can we see the correlation between the years?
Yes, you can. And interestingly enough, I tried to pull up Wyndham, for example. No Wyndham. I don't know where Wyndham was. So there are some holes in the DOE website with regard to some of this information, but I could probably go back on most of those districts and do a past comparison.
So Meg, I'm confused about how the numbers, the 80% or more numbers, actually track with actual costs. I mean, you said, I think you said, that they should, the higher you are, the lower your cost should be.
Not necessarily. I would say that the higher your percentages are with regard to how many kids you can keep in the regular ed environment, it could impact overall costs. But there are other things that you would have to consider there. But what I do think that it impacts is your out-of-district costs. I can't say definitively that that's true, but I think that the work that we do with families to build and gain their trust, and all of the efforts that we put into allowing their children to be able to access the regular ed curriculum like all of the other students, that goes a long way when you're finally at a point where it isn't working and you need to pull them out for longer periods of time. There isn't sort of that push and pull or that fight that there might otherwise be. I do think there's a correlation between that statistic and your out-of-district costs. Can't prove it, David.
Okay. So, Howard was on to something I wanted to follow up on, and that is that the data is there for longitudinal study.
Yep. Well,
it's there for
most of it, yeah.
Pardon me?
Well, most of it. Like I said, when I was looking, there are a few holes which I can't explain. I could try and find out from the DOE why those exist. But.
Okay, so we could track it for a 5 or 10 year period of time?
At least 5, I think.
At least 5,
too.
okay. And is the data there for other schools to compare against their longitudinal studies as well?
Yes.
I guess that would be interesting to see how we compare over time. The way I look at it is you get certain kids in, and eventually they move out. They are moving out. They're moving in and moving out.
If you're doing something right,
Hopefully,
you're
right.
right.
Right. So,
Eventually.
it'd be interesting to know if we, for example, keep, I don't know how to say this, but if we keep kids in our special needs, special education area longer or shorter. In other words, the bubble, whatever bubble there is, would persist.
Well,
You would see that in a longitudinal study, I think.
Yeah, it depends on the nature and severity of the disability types and at what grade levels those fall. Because there are a very small percentage of the population that we hang on till they're 21.
Paul?
Yeah, I keep coming back to something, Meg has said in the past, and that is we're not building widgets, we're building, we're helping human beings develop. And each one is different, so each district, as you said here, is different because the makeup of that special education is based on the individual needs or the combination of individual needs of the students in that district. So I'm not sure we're comparing over time, either within our district or comparing to other districts over time. I'm having trouble seeing the value there because their makeup is different and our makeup is different. It's a requirement, it's an educational requirement. So where we spend, how we deal with that requirement is the talent of our special education director, where we spend, but we get the hand that we're dealt, and we do the best we can with that hand. And compare the hand that we're dealt and the hand other districts are dealt can be completely different. So the costs themselves, I don't see where we can really compare them, because it's based on the hand that each district is dealt.
Hang on a second. The reason why I asked my question was because, go back to Kathy Skoglund, who was 2 before you. We had discussions that people were moving into our districts because of the special education. And, you know, it was never proven. So if we look at these numbers, can we tell whether people are moving in because of the...
You know, I would say I know a lot of people all over the state who do the same job that I do, and every single one of them here, that people are moving into their district because of special education. I would say to you as parents, and I have 4 children of my own, that nobody as a parent who knows that they have to undertake a move sits down and says, all right, I have 1 identified child and 2 who are not. Let me see if I can find the lousiest school system out there to move my family into. People move because of excellent educational systems, period. Not special education systems, excellent education systems. And I will tell you that really good special education programs begin with excellent regular education programs and interventions. They go hand in hand. You can't pull them apart and say people come to Amherst for special ed. Now, my ego would love that. I don't think it's true. Just isn't.
Mary Lou?
So, a couple things. I was on the special education part of the budget for a couple years, and I think it might have been when Renee was here, but that question was asked, and I believe that the average for the state was like 14 to 16%, and we fell like at 15. So we were right in the average as far as identified students in special ed. So to answer your questions, or your question, Howard, and then I also have to agree with Paul. I don't see how, with students moving in and out of districts, and perhaps they move because of a job change even, not because they're no longer in special ed, and with Meg stating that we don't have a lot of our special ed population staying until 21, I feel like tracking it over time and comparing it to other school districts is not comparing apples to apples at all. I'm not sure at all what that would tell us. You know, Meg said in her presentation that she knows out of 14 paras, you know, why we have the need and who they are tied to as far as students. She could not know that with Hollis. So I think I would be very careful with special ed trying to compare apples to apples, and I'm not sure what a longitudinal study would do other than take up Meg's time. And, you know, I have been very vocal, especially recently, about not taking up our administrators' time with things that we all don't think are beneficial.
Jim? Yeah, Jim had it first. and then-
You had first. You asked the question, Howard, so.
Oh,
Yeah, I defer, yeah.
So Meg,
I want to give everybody a chance to talk.
That's fine.
first off, I want to thank you for what you have done at the Amherst Middle School. I believe that having the students stay in district, as you said, is what's best for the students. But also, it translated into real dollars in our budget. And we realized a $76,000 savings this year in our budget. And we're hoping that that will continue. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the additional program that you've applied for. And then I have a follow-up question after that. So if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Just
So
briefly.
I'm working right now with the staff at Clark Wilkins and we sort of did this backwards, and there were a lot of reasons why, but to backward chain the self-contained program that we got program approval for at Amherst Middle School, we would like to submit for program approval for at Wilkins. What we really need is 3, because when you look to create a self-contained program, what you want to do is have the program housed in the building where the children would be able to still have access to the classrooms of their typical peers. So Clark Wilkins is 2 separate building spaces. So ideally, we'd like 2 separate self-contained programs, but we will be starting at Wilkins. And that's for a couple of different reasons. Number 1, space related. But number 2, the younger children are, quite frankly, a little bit easier to work with in an inclusionary way because the developmental gap is not, as big. The older they get, if they are really significantly impaired, that gap starts to widen and it becomes really not as easy to do that. So we are working on that right now. I'll be submitting for program approval with the DOE probably later this spring.
And I would expect that this will have a ripple effect in terms of preventing future needs and hopefully decreasing special education costs for
Yes.
the middle school and then for the high school.
Yes,
So-
and my hope, there really isn't any reason right now at the elementary level to have children out of district except for right now we don't have the capacity for a self-contained program and there are a small percentage of children who need that.
Yeah. So, thank you. I did want to ask, and I fully support this model that you're doing. Do you think that there are other models out there that could have some aspects of it that we may want to explore and potentially incorporate into our program?
Yes, some of the conversations that I've had, in particular with the regional directors, is with neighboring school districts, for example, not having everybody recreate the wheel. So if Amherst, for example, became the regional self-contained best practice experts on autism, and we had self-contained programs for that particular category disability, and Bedford became the regional best practice expert on emotional disabilities, and they created an in-district capacity. We've talked, had some conversations like that, which would be a considerable cost saving for all of us. So we're looking at those kinds of things, and we talk about this kind of thing all of the time. And if somebody has something, I was out at Conval, a few months ago, looking at a program that they had over there. I've been into Bedford, looking at programs that they have there. I have personal experience with a number of districts over in the Monadnock region, and I've created in-district programming opportunities over there. So there are always other better ways of doing things, and I remain open to all of that. The key is to stay on top of it and to keep learning and listening and watching and going to see what other districts are doing.
Thank you.
David?
I defer.
Anybody else? Well, thank you.
You guys don't even really look that glazed over. That's
I know we,
okay.
Thanks for breaking it down.
I know we have some public members here that had questions about this, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up to public. Meg?
Here, Maggie, you take mine.
Hi, Margaret McCabe. I just have one question related to the costs, and it's related to the CTE transportation, okay, which is in the budget for Sauhegan, $130,000. Is any of that costs, are any of those students special ed students? And are we capturing all our special ed costs in our lines? Because I'm concerned that, you're saying we're on the same percentage, but $130,000 transportation budget for Caring Hands kind of implies to me that we probably have special ed students that are being transported. So, and to my knowledge, I don't think that line would be captured under special ed, and so I'm asking, are we really capturing all our special ed costs?
The Caring Hands transportation, Caring Hands is the transportation provided for any out-of-district run. and any of our Sohegan High School students who access vocational programs are technically going out of district. So it is not a special education.
So those 14 students are not related
those-
to special ed?
No, those are students who are accessing vocational
And
programs.
I'll bring this up. I just, because it's so much per student, I thought they might be special ed. So that's,
I mean, you'll bring it up to clarify it? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
I'm going to bring it up to remind everybody that we're going to try to look at eliminating that cost. But if it was special ed related, I wanted to know if those students, because it's $9,285 a student for
Right.
transportation. If it was special ed related, I wanted to know that.
We have a separate line for special education.
No, I know that,
transportation.
but that's why I'm asking if it was related to any special ed, because I wanted to make sure it was being captured. If it's not, I still have a problem with that cost, but that's not.
Yeah, well, we do too, Maggie. So,
If it makes you feel better, I had that same question, did we capture everything? And through that process, I think we revisited you, what, 3 times, 2 or 3 times at least.
We
and went back
bonded,
to-
we bonded.
We kept bonding her, and
Was he in your
Lisa's
backseat?
there.
I was satisfied that, yes, we did capture everything in the special ed budget, so.
Yeah.
Was he in your backseat?
No, but next time.
No.
Lisa, did you have questions?
I do. And I have information that I think all of the Sauhegan board members have.
Can you have a microphone?
I will, but I
All
have,
right.
if so, I only have 7 copies. I had no idea that there were so many people. So if you've seen this information before, don't take one. If not, take one and pass it down. Okay, so my name's Lisa Eastland. I was on the Advisory Finance Committee for Sauhegan. So what I'm going to talk about is for Sauhegan specific, not the ASD. I want to start with thanking Meg for all of the time and effort, and I made notes on my phone of your entire thing so I can make a report and put it in my continuity report for the next person who does
I can
special ed
send it
next
to you
year.
if I-
So you don't, hopefully never have to explain some of this again, because I know that gets exhausting. What we talked about, and Mary Lou, you were right on target, what we currently have for percentage of students with IEPs is 13.59. As of 2012, 2013, state average was 15.4. So I think that they're moving to Amherst, the numbers don't support that at all. Hillsborough County is 14.4%, so we're still lower than our county for that. What I brought up as the Advisory Finance Committee person on this is, first we looked at the Sauhegan staff. There's 12 learning specialists that are broken out to 2 for the 2 freshman teams, 2 for the 2 sophomore teams, 5 for the juniors and seniors. There's 1 in the alternative program. I just wrote alt, so I'm not sure about that. 2 for transitions, and we have 17 paraprofessionals that service about 218 kids. 113 have IEPs, 105 are under 504s, and Meg explained what the differences is entailed with both of those. For the budget of this year, we are looking at $3.4 million. It's about 12% of the entire budget, or I'm sorry, almost 20% of the total budget. It is up almost 12%, but that is from out-of-district costs that there's nothing we can do about that, and transportation costs have driven that number up, as well as the healthcare and everything else that everybody's been dealing with. Those have gone up. Overall, and my math could be off, the salaries and benefits are about $80,000 more than they were last year. The cost is for salaries and benefits is about 65% of the entire budget, which is pretty much on track with all of them. What got me asking for a committee to look at, because I talked to Hollis, and their model of dispensing services is very different than ours. It may work for us, it may not, because our high school is different, and maybe their philosophies won't meld with ours, but they are, if you look at the paper I handed out, they are servicing basically the same number of kids with half the number of learning specialists and about a third less of the paraprofessionals. So while our staff is 29, they have a staff of 18. And the numbers are right in line with each other in terms of percentage of students needing services. So they are doing something very different. Now you look at these numbers and say, okay, there's about 15 or 16 kids who are not in the classroom as much as Sauhegan kids are. Maybe that works. Maybe that's what their IEP calls for. Who knows? And I think special ed is a very tangled ball of thread. And we have to look at special education and special educators as artisans. Each kid is unique, and we are producing a unique product with each kid because what they require is different. But I think it would behoove us as an SAU, as a high school, to at least look at, and I just checked Hollis, look at their model. And how are they comparing with, you know, what I say the numbers were, 29 to 18, 10 people less, that's a significant dollar amount. Additionally, one of the things Pete brought up, because we can line item and we can cut staff, but it's not ever really going to tackle the issue of special ed, that the state is driving more and more costs down to the districts. And until the districts and the schools say, something's got to give, something has to change, it's just going to be more and more. Pete brought up the example. If we have a student that's in residence and it costs us $200,000, we're paying for their entire 24-hour-a-day care. We pay for our kids here to be here for 8 hours a day. Medicare, Medicaid, insurance ought to be picking up those other 16 hours. That's a legislative problem. But until schools and school districts and all of our small towns band together and say something has to change, these costs are going to continue to go. They're going to continue to rise. It's an unsustainable model. In the meantime, I'm glad you're going to have a roundtable discussion, Peter. I think it's going to take a lot of people from different walks of life really talking about and investigating. Like, Hollis changed their entire model 2 or 3 years ago. So, Dave, what you were saying is the longitudinal study. In Hollis's case, it might be valuable to look at when they change their model, because then you have the empirical data. This is the way we were doing it. Now we're doing it differently. How did stats change? Overall, to compare us to Exeter, I don't know. But in that specific case, with a model change, you have a good kind of scientific method to look at. So that's what I have. If anybody has any questions of me, I know I just said a lot.
Any questions? Yeah?
I have a question for Meg. Have you read this?
No. I'm sorry. I thought I sent this to you. I'm so sorry. I know. I've included it before. But this was probably a draft. I'm so sorry.
David?
We've sent a lot of emails. Things have gotten lost along the way. Yes.
So when I talk about a longitudinal study, I'm not necessarily looking at I don't really know if I care that much about the year-to-year changes. But one of the things is that big data tells you a lot. You know, you can look at large amounts of data across a number of school districts and get some idea of what the profile of kids are. And, you know, I mean, I can't imagine they vary that much between Amherst and the other towns that you have by comparison up there. So, to me, just the idea of accepting that, you know, what we have in our own district, our own SAU, is sufficient. Is just not, to me. We need it. You kind of have to look at a bigger picture to make sure that you're in line or out of line or where it might stand. And that's all I'm asking for is a longitudinal study. And I don't think it's that hard to do. You know, I think it can be done.
As a taxpayer, what I hear you saying is I would rather have a volunteer do that and not pay a staff member to do that.
I will just point out, though, that one out-of-district placement probably
Overwhelms it.
3 full-time staff.
So Lisa, this doesn't include, like, so when you're comparing one SAU to the other, you're not including out-of-district costs, right?
I did not
So-
get into that. The person I spoke to, Amy Rowe, used to work special ed at Sauhegan. She's now at Hollis. So I thought she was a good person to talk to briefly about the differences in how services are dispensed. I tried to look at their budget for this year to see, but their line numbers didn't line up with ours, and it was, and some of the titles were different. It was very difficult to pull out, and they don't have it nicely encapsulated like Adam has done for me to say special ed is this. So I don't know in terms of what their final numbers are. I was just kind of looking at population versus staff. One of the things, and they're going to be facing it too, that everybody has to be moving towards is declining enrollment. We're going to have 40, 50 less kids. So if percentage-wise things are the same, we're going to have maybe 5 less kids with IEPs or whatever. You know, if you just kind of, those numbers stay the same statistically, numbers will, over the next years, continue to drop.
But then you have a big number right there, because you're showing Hollis with 5% out of district, us with less than 1%.
Okay.
So if that's not included in your cost comparison,
I didn't do a cost comparison.
well, you're implying that there's a major difference in cost.
In terms of staff, when you look at salaries and benefits, you know, yes, it might be an out-of-district, might be worth 3, but currently this year, we have 29, they have 18.
But when you're looking at percentages
Right.
of students and absolute numbers of teachers, I don't know what the population is of Hollis, so maybe their percentage
Right.
is a much lower number of actual students that they're helping. don't
I
know.
agree. So I probably misspoke by saying there's obviously savings, there may not be. What I was really kind of focusing on with my recommendation coming from the AFC was they're clearly dispensing services differently than we are. Amy said they had recognized savings from the moment the year they implemented it. I didn't dig deeper because I thought if we're going to have a committee, I'm not going to take up her time during budget season to ask a bunch of questions that somebody else is going to come back and ask the exact same questions in a month. I didn't feel like that was a valuable use of her time.
Mary Lou?
So I think this is a good idea, I think, for all of our costs comparing, and frankly, our board has a budget study committee that hasn't met recently because of budget season, but met for 2 years year-round, looking at how we can save money and how we compare to other districts on not just special ed. As a matter of fact, special ed, Meg was at our meetings, but special ed wasn't even a big part of it. A lot of it had to do with negotiations, salary and benefits, and things like that. But my point was going to be exactly what Pete just said, is that by all comparisons Meg showed us today, we're performing better for our students and for our taxpayers, it seems, than other districts are. And again, I'll go back to, I think, what Paul said and maybe Jim, that it's just not comparing apples to apples to take the number of learning specialists one district has compared to another without knowing the needs of the students. That's really difficult, but looking up at the screen, and again, Hollis, Brookline, Hollis, and Brookline are all separate, but boy, they sure seem to have a lot more out-of-district student placements, and those can add up to a lot of paraprofessionals or learning specialists if they were in district. So I'm pretty happy with the numbers we see, in particular where out-of-district goes, and the numbers that Meg showed us as far as how well we are doing for our students, for our identified students, because the state set standards for, a reason, and I can't reiterate them all right now, Meg could, but as far as the amount of time they spend in and out of classroom, the 5 different measurements that the state does, and it seemed like we were doing really well on all of them.
Jim?
I just wanted to ask one more question of Meg. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So you must work with Amy and talk to her all the time, right?
Yep, she's on the same regional directors meetings and state level directors meetings.
Do they have a different model than we have?
They do.
They do.
They have more of a resource room model. So it's not an inclusionary model. They take, say there's 15 kids who have, disability in reading. They go to the resource room and that's where they get their reading instruction. We try and do it more of an inclusionary way.
Right in the classroom.
What I think would be interesting on that, because Amy and I did talk about that, and I work in our schools. I see the kids in the classroom. I sub as a para. I am in and out of the classroom with kids and taking them down, especially at the middle school, down to room 10, if there's something difficult, or going to the library, and then we come back. I do that all the time. You know, she said the kids love it and seem to be doing, and asked, why didn't we do this sooner? But unless you had a kid who was here and went there, or there and then went here, I can't really take that as, well, the kids love it. So I couldn't take that as gospel. But would be interesting to find out is what the percentage is since they changed their model. If you're looking at test scores, when do they go out of needing less and less services on IEP? That would be, I think, an interesting number to look at.
There just is the least restrictive continuum that by law you have to follow.
Right.
So even if I had 20 students who could be put into a resource room to get their instruction, staff would not be following the law.
Well, but Hollis follows the law. I mean, if we can't.
What Hollis does is up to Hollis.
So
What we
could I
do is
say-
follow the law.
so could I just-
I understand, but
We follow the law based
Can
on
I hold
the
on for
students
one
we have.
second, please? So we're discussing another school district here, and I have not talked to the superintendent there, I've not talked to staff members, I've not talked to citizens, so I'm not really sure how their special ed program goes.
Right.
I know Meg does. We also want to be careful mentioning names in public, mentioning a room number.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it's okay, but I think, just as a reminder.
Yes.
Because all of our kids are important to all of us. I just want to make sure we do that. Meg, I know you've talked with other people so you meet with a group of special ed directors regionally and statewide, and you talk about different programs that we have in our schools. I think when I started teaching English in 1972, that resource rooms were there, and they have gone really way past. So for schools in general that have resource rooms, are those best practices today? I'm not picking on any district, I'm just saying the practice itself.
That is not a practice that a lot of districts utilize anymore, because there are other ways to get kiddo services. One of the things that we do, for example, at the middle school, is we create a universal schedule, so that there's a period of time that is set aside for all students to get some type of intervention. Some children are getting enrichment during that time. Some children are getting speech during that time. Some children are getting reading intervention during that time. But there are other more progressive ways to educate children with disabilities now. I remember back when I started teaching too, and we had resource rooms where the children came and we provided services. That, I haven't done things like that in a long time.
Hang on, Bill.
So one of my questions just got answered. How can Hollis pull that off? Because it doesn't seem less restrictive to
I
me.
can't,
I know.
Peter, I can't speak to what.
Right, no. I think I'm actually gonna refrain, given what Peter said.
Hang on, Dave. Amy, did you have a question?
Nope.
Okay, Dave?
So, Meg, we're a coalition school. We believe in individualized education. We believe in certain strictures and, teacher facing, that kind of thing. Is our process a heavyweight process for special ed or a lighter weight process for special ed? I know that's not an easy question to answer, What I'm saying is that does being a coalition school help us educate special needs kids more effectively, or with less costs, or more efficiently? I know it's a broad question.
I think being a coalition school helps us educate all kids more effectively.
I'm talking about special ed now. Let's talk about the niche of special ed.
Can we get Meg a microphone, or?
That's a good idea.
I'm nervous about people missing out on such learning discussion.
So the philosophy of Sohegan, and I would venture to say the philosophy also of Amherst and Mount Vernon, since my time here, has been one of full inclusion. Because in my experience and in what I know to be best practice, that is the way we educate all children. Their right is to be fully included with their typical peers. That's where they should be. And if we can do that in a cost-effective way and meet their needs, that's what we need to do. That's the law. Whether or not Sohegan as a coalition school makes it more difficult for special educators, no, I don't believe so. I can't imagine that if Sohegan were not a coalition school, we would be doing things much differently, because again, we're following much the same model in Amherst and in Mount Vernon.
So what you're saying is there's no cost impact to being a coalition school relative to special ed. Is that your statement?
Howard, can I give a point of information? There is nothing in our mission statement or our 10 common principles that refers to special ed any different than any other school. So I think that kind of answers the question. There's nothing that refers to special ed.
Well,
Tim?
Not that I'm aware of, Dave.
okay.
That helps.
Tim?
In an effort to move along, correct me if I'm wrong, is there a roundtable here that's going to be brought up? So it's been very informative, first of all, and I appreciate all the work we put into this. But because there's going to be a roundtable coming up, I think we should thank you, everybody, both for your time, presentation, and let's kind of move this along and get on with the rest of our agenda.
I agree, and that's what I was going to say after the last question. The superintendent has already notified us that he was going to have a roundtable, and then he can come back and give us recommendations. If everybody's okay with that.
So we're planning one probably in the 3rd or 4th week of February or around that time frame. For the public, Meg will be there, of course. We're also Meg is going to come back in the April SAU meeting. There's a lot of questions around special ed. There's a lot of questions about cost. And those questions need to be presented and answered. So that's our goal in doing those. So I want to make sure that you're aware, and I hope that will help.
Good, thank you. Next on the agenda is strategic planning outcomes, the framing pillar, or framing.
So Micah Killian has agreed and supported our work and helped us. One of the bottlenecks of our strategic plan was to really look at outcomes from that plan. Mike has some expertise in that area. I've asked him to help out. He's been gracious with his time. He's going to do a presentation tonight about that. Christine is going to kind of fold into part of that presentation, looking at the work that's being done with our advanced committee, and probably will fold into our other pillar committees as we go along. We may not have time at the end to discuss a lot of this, but I'm also putting in, as you can see on the agenda, try and have another SAU board meeting on the 23rd of February as well for the follow-up work from this and my favorite word, policies, to get some moved across as well. So, Mike, I'm going to leave that up to you, and thank you for being here.
Did you want to take a 2-minute break here, or do you just want to keep going?
I'm sorry?
Did you want to take a 2-minute break or just dive into this?
I'm going to leave that up to the chair and the board. I think people right now, I'm going to look at the group and say, I think they want to plunge ahead. Okay. That's my read, I think. Am I correct in that? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
How many slides do you have?
40. Okay, so as was pointed out, you folks have been talking about outcomes and their value as part of your strategic thinking. And so I said I'd be happy to come and talk about outcomes and sort of set them in the context of strategic governance, because it doesn't make any sense to talk about outcomes out of context. So I'm actually going to cover 7 different areas. Just a very quick overview of strategic governance and the cycle of strategic thinking and planning, and the roles of school boards and school administration in strategic governance, because that's absolutely crucial to getting outcomes done right and well. In their own right, trying to come up with outcomes is incredibly challenging. It has been for centuries. And so this is probably the hardest element of strategic planning of any of the elements that you've wrestled with, and it may account for why it's one of the things that you're getting around to at this point. We here talk about outcomes and dashboards, and I'm going to explain what they are and the difference between goals and outcomes, which is especially important. And I shared some of this presentation with the advance committee when they were thinking about STEM and STEM outcomes. And people liked this presentation. They said, we'd like to do it. And then Christine and Bethany and others of us were going to go away and try and think about taking a stab at STEM outcomes for science as an initial thing to share with you. But then we did some thinking about it and said we should probably find a way to nest outcomes into a larger framework. Because one of the issues is administration and board members are talking about things all the time in these kinds of meetings. And it may not always be clear what the transaction is that's being discussed around outcomes. So what we've done, in addition to taking a crack at science outcomes, very preliminary pass to share with you, for you to take on board, is we also would like to propose a framework into which you can fit outcomes and see if that would work for you. And then Christine and Dave will actually hand out the first pass of standards for science, very rough, very preliminary, for some discussion around that. Okay, and this is a fairly dense presentation. You've already been sitting here for an hour and a half. So feel free to ask questions. I'm going to try and move along at a good clip, but there's a lot in here to sort of digest. But if you have questions or comments along the way, please ask. Yeah.
Mike, would the board be able to have this presentation sent to them?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so we'll get that out to them tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about strategic governance, sort of at the highest level. And it really consists of 2 things: strategic thinking about where are we, where do we want to go, and then operational governance, which is what's everything we have to do to get there and to make sure it happens. And really, putting those 2 things together is really applied leadership for municipalities and schools. And I just want to do a quick overview of that. So the framework for strategic governance has to do with what are some of the things you do to decide where you want to go over time, and what are some of the things you do to make sure you get there. So really, strategic thinking has 2 main components to it. One is, what's your vision of the future, and what measurable goals are you setting to know that you've gotten there when you've arrived? And operational governance has 2 sets of things, which is, are there any particular strategic initiatives that we need to work into our day-to-day activities in order to achieve what we want? And then what are we putting in place in terms of implementation, oversight, and reporting to make sure we're making the progress every year toward where we want to go? So this portion is really about what to achieve, okay? And this portion is about how to achieve it, okay? That's sort of strategic governance in general. This particular approach, by the way, I actually created it for academic institutions. And so the Association of Governing Boards of Colleges and Universities actually uses some of these ideas as their best practices for their 1,900 colleges and universities and their individual members. And we use this approach tailored to government beginning in 2013, and it's been ongoing and updated ever since. So just for some context, this actually began as an educational institution approach. The whole idea, and what makes this somewhat different, is you don't just do a strategic plan in year 1 and revisit it in year 5 or 10. What you do is you take a look, you try and understand the past, you try and envision where you want to go, and then you focus on managing the present. And you make this pass every year, because things change all the time. So you're constantly adjusting your strategic thinking and your goals as you go along. There are a number of work products that come out of this approach to strategic thinking and governance. It gets divided up into a work plan, an approach to strategic thinking, an approach to operational governance, and you'll see over on the right that there are visions and strategic initiatives and vision dashboards. This has been laid out to make a pass over the course of a year, the first pass in the course of a year. When we did this for town government, we did it in 4 months. So the first pass to a strategic plan for every one of the departments we went through that in 4 months, which is probably the shortest time I've ever seen it done anywhere. There's a lot of talk about dashboards. There are ways of looking at history that become very clear. By the way, let me just define dashboard. In our automobiles, we have a dashboard. And the auto manufacturers decide on the most important things that we should see as drivers that tell us how our automobile is performing. And now you have an ever-expanding thing with GPS and lane departure systems and all of that to tell you where you are on your trip. There's an awful lot of information that gets served up in a prioritized fashion. Historical dashboards are a way of looking at the most important information about the past. Vision dashboards are a way of looking at the future. And current dashboards help you deal with the operational things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. The timelines on these can be very different. For a current dashboard, you may be looking at things monthly or certain things quarterly. For a vision dashboard, you may be looking out 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And historically, you may not have kept a lot of data for certain sets of years, so the amount of time you're taking a look at could be different. I'll talk more about this in a bit. So when you think of the elements of a strategic plan, these are the elements. The mission, and these words get used a lot in different ways, but the mission is why the organization exists, and it doesn't change. The vision is how the organization plans on fulfilling its mission for the strategic period of time. And that does change, because the world changes. You have different focus, different needs at certain time periods that you need to adjust to. Then you have outcomes. And outcomes are really constituent-centered results. Okay, that's the key, and I'll come back and talk more about that. And then you have investments. So what are the initiatives and the resources necessary to achieve those outcomes, to fulfill that vision, to support that mission? And what's the timing of all of this? When would you be making certain investments in year 1, in year 2, in year 3? And really what we're talking about here is this. This is the focus for tonight. Probably the most important thing to share tonight is the notion that all outcomes are goals, but not all goals are outcomes. Okay? And it takes a while to wrap your head around this, so I thought I'd just put it out here now, and then we'll spend some time talking about it as we go. So you remember this, strategic thinking, what to achieve, and then how to achieve it. If you go through the state statutes for educational institutions, public schools, it's many, many pages of dictates about what's the role of boards, what's the role of principal, what's the role of superintendent. If you distill many, many pages of this down, each of you has 3 roles. So the board's role, number 1, determine the educational goals, develop long-range plans, and identify measurable and attainable short-term objectives. That's a quote, that's a direct quote from the statutes. That's under the board, okay? Now, board members will say, we're lay people, we have people who are specialists in education, and it's not like the legislature doesn't know that, but they're saying it's the role of the board to sort that out. It's also the role of the board to prepare a budget, and then there's a whole array of specified broad-based policies that the board is supposed to fill out. When you move to administration, and that is starting with the superintendent and then migrating down to principals and department heads and whatnot, they have 3 roles. One is to develop and maintain a system of public schools. So how many schools, where are they located, what grades do they serve, things of that sort. Second, their job is to develop an educational plan that includes curriculum, instruction, assessment, and a program of studies. And their third goal is to achieve that, okay? Now, there is a great interdependency here because board members don't have the wherewithal on their own to do that in isolation. And if this is set the wrong way, the administration doesn't have a prayer of fulfilling its obligations. So again, this is, of all of these different things, tonight the focus is on this, okay? I thought people might be interested in seeing where these are in the statutes, okay? So when you get the presentation, if you're interested in reading about this, those are the actual paragraphs in the statutes. One of the things that the statutes also do is discuss what the interaction and the role is between the boards and administration. And it's wrapped in a concept called responsibility charting, where literally people in any institution can clearly negotiate what role different constituents are playing in particular decisions. The acronym that's used is over on the right. Who gets to approve a decision? Who gets to be consulted prior to a decision being made? Who gets informed of the decision when it is made? And who decides? Okay, so those are the four acronyms. And when you look at the statutes, the three at the top are the role of the board. Develop plans and outcomes, the board decides what it is, but consults with administration because they can't do it on their own. And informs the voters, and if something is big enough, you probably consult with the voters on that. Developing the budgets, again, you consult with administration, the board decides, and the voters approve. Okay? Develop policies, the board, again, you have this interrelationship. When it gets down to administration, what gets specified is developing the school system, the administration decides what the configuration of the schools are, and the board approves it, and depending upon how big a deal or change you're making, you take it to the public for their approval. Developing an educational plan, the administrators decide, the board approves. Achieving educational objectives, the administration informs the board about certain kinds of outcomes and progress, and the board decides whether those objectives have been made. Okay? That's what we're focusing on tonight. So, any questions about that before we move on? Okay, the challenges of measurement and assessment. You know, since Plato's time, there have been lots of arguments about measurement and assessment and how to do it and whatnot. I did a little true and false thing here. What we measure is what matters. It's what changes platitudes into priorities. If you say something is important but you don't measure it, everyone sort of understands that you didn't take the time to measure it, and it's probably not something to pay attention to. What we don't measure doesn't matter. That's false. There are probably a number of things that you think are pretty important that you have not yet been measuring. What someone else tells us to measure may not matter to us, like kneecap, right? There's a contingent here who's saying there's a lot of issues around kneecap. We don't buy it, we were told to do it, but we're kind of not on board with it. We might be better off not measuring if our measurement tools are flawed. No, you really should be using the best tools you have. It's an imperfect process and will continue to be. But not to measure is worse than measuring and then wrangling about it. And then finally, measuring at the right time is as crucial as what and how to measure. That's clearly true. You know, we've heard about situations where students in this district end up taking tests on subject matter that they haven't had yet, right? It's like, okay, what's up with that? So it's not that you want to teach to a test, but you've got to be sensitive. You know, are you applying your measurements at the right time? Okay. So why is this such a thorny issue? Because it's always hard to figure out, how do you know that somebody knows something? There's a couple ways people come at it. You know, valid equivalency. If someone can have demonstrated recall that they know something, then maybe they know it. If they can demonstrate competency, maybe that's a better indication that they know something. But there's sort of an equation at work here. Then you have the issue of valid testing. If someone can retain something on a short-term basis, does that mean they know it? Or should they remember it for long-term retention? And then there's the issue in some special needs children of regression, that they knew something and then they regress, right? And so this becomes a very dynamic and messy process to go through. And in our district, we have even more moving parts to make this fairly challenging. We're changing approaches to education, in some cases moving to PACE. There sometimes is a lack of clarity about whose role is what. You'll often hear a board member say to Christine, what outcomes will you achieve for what you're doing? And that reinforces the notion that the board and the administration are not necessarily doing their jobs. It might be a fairer question for a board member to say, tell us what relevant measures PACE can provide so we can look at those and decide which of them we're going to select and where we are and what we want to do. Help us with that. But, you know, there's some shifting that should happen. And then, to make matters even more challenging, when you're changing the measures you're using, along with changing the curricula, you've got everything in flux. And so you might be moving from kneecap to smarter balance. You may say, well, we should pay attention to SATs. We're moving to PACE. So one of the things that's really interesting, an example that I shared with the group, is the measurement of the SMOOT. How many of you know what the SMOOT is? Okay, some of you already know this, but it's an example of a new measure being created. So back in 1958, Oliver Smoot was a fraternity pledge at MIT, and he and some of his friends had been out imbibing a bit and decided that they would measure the length of the Harvard Bridge in Cambridge in smoots. So they asked him to start laying down at the edge of the bridge, and they would put a mark. And he did this for quite a while, and then he said, I'm so exhausted, that they picked him up. And the rest of the way, every length, they laid him down, they made a mark. Okay? And they ultimately calculated that the bridge was 364.4 smoots, plus or minus 1 ear, for a level of inaccuracy. Well, it started off as a prank. But today, the Cambridge police, instead of using 6-foot designations, they use the 5 feet 7 inch designations, and they will literally announce to a radio car that there was an accident at Smoot number 250, right? So it persists from a prank. Today, you can use, on Google, you can use Smoot as an optional measure, okay? And you can also do it in Google Earth and Maps, if you want, right? And so the ultimate example of the impact of measurement is Oliver Smoot graduated, became a lawyer, and then ended up chairing, of all things, the American National Standards Institute and the International Organization for Standardization. So, as you wrestle with the idea of outcomes, maybe there'll be a new measure that you come up with, like the land roll or the Beauchamp, right? So I just sort of keep that in mind. Okay, another important point is tracking does not equal goal setting, does not equal measuring outcomes, okay? Tracking is retrospective. There may be some things that you pay attention to, and you look back and say, how did we do last year, okay? It is like looking in the rear view mirror of the car, okay? Whereas goal setting is prospective and conveys a kind of intentionality in the future, okay? Some goals are inputs or investments. Some goals are things that help you achieve the broader constituent-oriented outcomes that you want to achieve. So other goals are outcomes, some goals are inputs. It's probably confusing, but I'll explain it a little bit more. The idea is the outcomes that you folks select ought to be things that directly benefit key constituents. In other words, they're human-centered in nature, okay? So, what goals and outcomes should be, the acronym is SMAC, specific, measurable, achievable, and challenging, okay? I think you probably all know that. we talk about KPIs, key performance indicators, and that's a business term, and it tends to be institutionally oriented. How is our institution doing? Okay? It's the same concept of dashboards, but human-centered outcomes is what I think you should be focusing on, because these are kids, right? You may want to measure certain things in the institution, but what we're trying to assess is, what do our students know, the academic outcomes. What do our students know? What are their skill sets for career? And what's their sense of self, right? So you got 3 categories of things to try and figure out. And then, of course, you could have outcomes focused on teachers and staff. You could have focused outcomes for parents and for taxpayers. So you got a lot of moving parts and a lot of different things to try and pay attention to. Let me give you an example of what I mean by goals as inputs and goals as outcomes. Because when people don't have real clear outcomes in mind, they make the inputs the goals. So for example, I'm taking the first 3 from town government, because we're all in the same community. At one point, a goal for the police department was to add a new officer. But when you press on that and say, well, why? The outcome they're aiming for is to reduce property crime by 15%. So that's the people-centered outcome. This happens to be an input. I would submit that shouldn't even be considered a goal. It should be listed as an investment that needs to be made in order to achieve that outcome. The DPW had a goal of increasing the budget by $2.4 million annually. Well, that's not really the goal. The outcome they're aiming at is by 2030, having 70% of our roads in good to excellent shape. So that would be the citizen-oriented outcome. Our tax department has a goal to acquire accounts receivable software. But when you probe a little bit, it's really to maintain a tax collection rate greater than 94%. Okay? And then I picked one that had to do with the schools. There was a goal to institute full-day kindergarten. But when you talk to people or thought about what was being proposed, the outcome was really to have kids prepared to go into first grade. Okay? So you could list all of these as goals, but these are really in service to those kinds of outcomes. The other piece is, no one goal is usually sufficient to say how you're doing. And having multiple ways of looking at something can be very useful. This is the Recreation Department's vision dashboard. They believe that if they're doing these 4 things, they will be running a really good recreation department. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but one has to do with numbers of participants, citizens participating, the number of facilities available to them, Babusick Lake, the use of Babusick Lake, and the mix of different programming across different age ranges. Right? So they pick 4 key things. They measure a bunch of other stuff as well. The tax department had 4 things. Keep the collection rate high, make sure, on average, there are about 90 families a year who run into some kind of difficulty and their property becomes liened for taxation. But because they work with them, the department works with them so well, over a period of time, they all get caught up. So you can't say, we'll only have 70 people have a problem, right? That's not a goal to set. But the goal that they set is, we want the slope, the downward slope of resolution to be the same. Okay? So at the top, in any given year, maybe the town is owed $500,000, and in 7 years, it's all paid off. Okay? Police department, they have 4 different ones. Again, I won't go through it. But it's the notion that you've got to pick a certain cluster of things to pay attention to. So who are we attending to? Well, we have students, and even there, you probably need to break them into subgroups with maybe different outcomes. Maybe Meg is paying attention to, what percentage of the special ed population works themselves out of IEPs over what period of time. That would be a different kind of outcome than mainstream kids, and you might want to have outcomes for gifted kids, right? So again, there's like a Rubik's Cube of things to be thinking about. And again, you probably want to be thinking about teachers, staff, administration, retaining them, professional development outcomes, things of that sort. How should you compare? Should you just look at your own outcomes in isolation? Should you compare them to recognized standards and trends in the country, or compare them to comparable schools, or maybe to aspirational schools? Well, I think E, you should be doing some of all of those kinds of things. So when you're wrestling with outcomes, you're really undertaking a lot of stuff. You want outcomes that guide your activities and decisions. You're trying to do this among shifting educational efforts and measures. You want to model and respect the interdependent but different roles of the board and the administration. You want to get input from other people. You want to tie your plans and budgets to those outcomes, because that's the reason you're asking for money, is to achieve those kinds of things. And then recognize that this is a work in progress and you're not going to get it right in 1 year. It's going to be an ongoing kind of process. And the biggest thing is to make sure that these elements of a strategic plan are aligned. And being really clear about the measures is a really good way to do that and to bring that in line. Okay, how do you go about doing outcomes? There are 4 sets of activities. I won't read them, they're right there. Each one has some sub-things to pay attention to. You know, how do we categorize what we value? You know, academics might be one, functional skills might be one, personal growth might be one. You know, what is it? What are the categories that you want to pursue? You value a lot of things. I just took things off the different websites, right? And so here are things that you value. You know, here are things that I'm sure this is all familiar to you. There are lots of things listed. There's some overlap, you know, among things. But you're on record as caring about a lot of stuff. You know, these are core values from the website, more core values. So of all of those things you value, question number 2 is, what do you measure today? And what does the map of measures look like? Okay. And then what do you consider important but don't measure today that ought to get added to that portfolio? The third part is, how are we doing with what we measure? You know, where do we stand today? How do we compare with others, whoever you elect to compare yourself to? And how do we define excellence in each area? So if we're here today, but we think excellence is here, then what are we going to do to go from where we are to there? What's it going to take to do that, and over what period of time? So, you know, what do we want to see over what period of time? And with what frequency will we measure and how? So there's discrete things you can do. You know, it's like, how do you eat the elephant? You know, one bite at a time. Okay, so there's a way you can go through this. Now I want to switch to the whole notion of a framework. You can have an outcomes framework for academics, for finances, for personnel, for a number of things. We're focusing on academics. And what we wrestled with is, you've got 9 different educational content areas, okay, in the K through 12 arena. You want to be able to discuss, decide on, measure, and manage outcomes for every one of these areas, okay? So 9 areas. Then what we said is, well, okay, instead of just picking numbers and saying these are the outcomes, they should be nested in some categories in a framework. So what are the overarching goals of our literacy program, or our science program, or our wellness program? What's the academic philosophy that we're following in that particular area? Unite is working to come up with a unified educational philosophy, but it may turn out that different academic philosophies apply to each of those 9 things somewhat differently. So are you looking for one, or is it enough to say, for science, this is the educational philosophy, for literacy, it's something different? How are we doing with the teacher cadre we have? Do we have the right mix of teachers who are certified in the right areas to help us do what we want to do? Are we clear about the domains and the curricula, or do we have to create that? The next generation science standards give you a whole bunch of things. They don't give you the curriculum, right? So to follow that, you have to build curricula for everyone, for, you know, K through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, for science, math, engineering, computer, whatever, okay? So where do you stand with that? What are the standards that the curricula and the teachers should be imparting? What measurement tools are you going to use to be clear about how you're doing? What are the desired outcomes? Where are you currently? Where do you want to go? And what investments and inputs do you need to achieve what you're aiming for? So what we did is we took science from STEM and made a first pass at laying out these elements. And Christine's going to sort of share that. Dave will weigh in as well. But when you think about it, if you're very clear, if Christine comes to a presentation and is talking to you about a particular topic area, it'll be really clear which category is she talking to you about. It'll be clear about, is she informing you of progress she made on something that you approved? Is she consulting with you to get your input because she's working on something that she's preparing to bring to you to be approved? What's the transaction that's going on? And what part of this are you guys dealing with at a particular meeting or working session? Okay? So let me stop and have Christine take over.
This is something that Bethany and I developed in working with both Mike as well as Dave. This is something the advance pillar has not seen yet, so this is kind of something new we've been working together on and just working over the past few days, so it still needs to go to the advance committee. It's really a sample. It's partially complete. It's not totally complete. It was just to have an exemplar for you to be able to see what this framework might look like. So once everyone has a copy, I'll walk you through the framework. With this framework, we started with an overarching goal for science, really looking at both STEM, but really more of a focus on science specifically, and then we have some sub-goals. And these were partially developed in the advance committee. It's something we have to come back to them with for a tuning. We don't have the educational philosophy portion filled in yet. That's something that we still need to work on. And we started working on the teacher content, competency, and pedagogy piece. And then the domains and the curricula, that comes right from our next generation science standards. And then our standards on the next page, it really outlines for you from the next generation science standards, those 3 different dimensions. And when we've come to present to boards about our science curriculum, you may have heard us speak about those different dimensions. And then we gathered all the different measurement tools that we have access to for measuring science. And even we've talked about, do we do a separate one of these for math? So these are really more science. But some, like the SAT scores, would be for math. So it's still a piece we're kind of working on. And then from there, you can move into desired outcomes. And the outcomes really need to be collaboratively developed. And we have a sample here, but the sample isn't even completely done, which is intentional. So the example is looking at the 5-year mean percentage of students earning a 3+ or 3 or above on the AP chemistry exam. And for Sauhegan, that's 56.82%. So that falls above the global 5-year mean, but it's just below the New Hampshire 5-year mean. And I apologize, this isn't in color, so it's a little difficult to see that with the 2 different lines. So our goal, and this was just a goal Bethany and I developed, would be for the Sauhegan percentage of students scoring a 3+ would increase to 70%. Over, well, how many years? We don't know yet. We still need to collaborate with teachers and with the advance committee to determine what that would be. So in looking at that outcome, we then have to go back or go to the next page and really look at the different inputs that we need in order to reach that goal. And this is for goals 1 and 2. And we have had long discussions in our advanced committee about breaking out K-8 from 9-12 STEM major and 9-12 non-STEM major, because there's a certain expectation that we have for all of our students when it comes to STEM, but then there might be other expectations for students wishing to pursue a STEM career, and we want to make sure that we support those students in that pathway as well. And the last page is really more for goal 3, which is around beliefs, so self-efficacy, and there's the inputs for that as well. So this is a total draft, something we worked up just over the past few days to be able to share an example of you of what this framework might look like. And Bethany did a ton of work on this, so she was a huge support in developing this, and we did a lot of preliminary data digs, but we certainly have more work to go to flesh it out a bit. Are there questions on this framework? Yeah, Jim.
First of all, this is so awesome.
Good.
Wow.
Yeah, Mike was a
Love
huge
this.
help in guiding the he developed the framework and then guided us in.
This is exactly what we were
reading
trying to
it.
get to at the last meeting, so this is beautiful. Just a quick question though, this is like, this is all, you know, like culturally aligned to the coalition principles and all that. This fits right into our school functions and.
It's a good question. So, you know, there have been interesting discussions about AP courses and how in line that is with coalition principles of, you know, having mixed groups. It's really not a mixed group, but the importance of AP. So it's hard for me to answer as far as in line with coalition principles. I mean, we should be using data to help drive our instruction and to support all of our students, so that certainly is in line. I don't know if you're specifically talking about AP or...
I was just curious.
Just in general.
I mean, mostly it
Yeah.
mostly does.
Mhm.
I mean, we already have AP courses anyway.
And
we're a
we
coalition
have,
school,
yes,
so,
yeah.
I mean, there's precedent for that.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, because that was one of the topics of conversation we had in the last meeting, like whatever we came up with to make sure it was culturally aligned, because that's how it's going to get adopted. Otherwise, it could change all the people.
Right.
So, okay.
I think an important piece is collaborating with the teachers. So this was done absent our AP chemistry teachers or any of our science department at Sauhegan. This was just me and Bethany trying to gather some information and have a template to be able to share, you know, a partially complete template to share with you. So that's an important piece, which is why we didn't feel we could actually say, you know, that 70% could be reached in 2 years or 4 years or 5 years. We really need to work with the teacher on that.
Tremendous.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dave.
So I wanted to give some kudos to some people here. First of all, Mike, you know, when I talked to Mike several months ago, we had this idea of how we're going to approach this, and Mike was pushing this whole idea of strategic governance. The second thing we had was a meeting where we came to realize, this is the STEM team now, we came to realize that we were talking past each other about a lot of things, what outcomes were, what the goals were, and that kind of thing. And after that meeting, I got a phone call from an individual, and the individual sitting to my right. And I had to put the phone down, and when I heard the message, I had to put the phone about 2 feet away from myself so I could hear what he was saying. And it occurred to me that we needed to really get into the whole idea of outcomes and really define outcomes and figure out exactly where we wanted to go with the outcomes and have a common definition of those, which Mike has helped us with immensely. I will say that a lot of the people in the advanced committee did not get engaged right away. I mean, we tried to keep this a small kind of thing so we could kind of get organized and set up the framework before we brought it out and brought it to everybody else, you know, Pim and Kim and Jim himself. So
Yeah. There just wasn't enough time to bring everyone
We
together.
needed to get things rolling a little bit in terms of the framework so we could actually come to some
Right.
better advances in this whole thing in the advanced committee. Now, the advanced committee consists of 6 initiatives. One of the initiatives is STEM, and we're focused on that because we think we can use that as a way of guiding other committees with a framework. We think we can guide other committees through the same kind of process, and hopefully that'll work for other people as well. And that's really the intent of our goal right now.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And we really, in order to bring this together, Dave's right, we had to work as a small group, and we really worked only over the past week probably to pull this together. So our goal would be to have this not just for STEM, but to look at other areas that this could be developed. But we thought seeing an actual prototype would be helpful for you. Amy?
So I have a question. So this is terrific, great start.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that were 9, I believe, categories that we're looking at. Can you explain how we will be able to take all of those separate 9 and perhaps incorporate them into a larger overarching framework for the district, or for separate schools, or for separate school districts, or how that process might work?
So there are 9 categories. Each one deserves this treatment, right? And that's for academics.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's sliced and diced by grade level. You then may want, in each one of those areas, to be thinking about gifted kids, mainstream classroom, special needs. But then there could be other kinds of things that are outcomes oriented as well, right? Back to like finances, resource allocation, all of that kind of stuff. But if you do these 9 things, this will drive almost everything else that you do, and will help explain why your budgets are your budgets, or help you decide, well, if we do need to cut, where might we cut, because it's not in service necessarily to this. I actually, I think this raises a lot of questions. It's, this is the first time you've seen this, and so you need to digest it and sort of think about all of these contexts that we've put out there. Is there any way that you would modify this? Are there categories that aren't here on this template that ought to be? Do you think there are some things that we tried to capture that don't make any sense? So I think you guys need some time to sort of mull this over. And then a very important, 2 really important questions are you organized appropriately to do this work? Because you're now organized in 5 pillar groups, where all of this work rests with the advanced pillar, with the exception of academic philosophy, right? And so this is a boatload of work to do. And this is, as I said before, this is the hardest piece of the entire strategic plan, which is why it often is the last thing to be tackled. So I would suggest you think about, should there be subgroups that get put together? It can't also just be these guys and Bethany either, right? So do you begin to use a portion of each board meeting to do this? Do you, how should you organize is something to think about. And then the other question is, how long will it take to put in place? Now, you don't want this to take 4 years to put in place, right? You kind of have to do it in a hurry. So I want to be the first to acknowledge that to do a K through 12 pass at this is a lot of work. The benefits are manifold. If you do this work, regardless of the fact that you've got 3 different districts under an SAU board, you will be collaborating and thinking about handoffs between K through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12. I mean, this it's not a solution to not consolidating or to consolidate, but it's a way to keep all of you aligned in the work and the thinking that you're doing. And I think that could be a huge benefit. But if you tackle this, there are some really important outcomes for the administration and the board. You're rebalancing roles, you're rebalancing workloads. It's a way to fulfill your obligation to the statutes and to cover all the bases, because there's a whole bunch of bases to be covered. So this may be a direction to go in, but there's an awful lot more thinking that you guys should be doing about this, and maybe some of that becomes the next conversation around this. Okay?
Can I make another statement here, Mike?
Yeah.
one of the things we decided to do is come up with outcomes that are the finished product. In other words, when a student graduates from Sauhegan, we came to the conclusion that's the finished product. And what are the attributes or what are the key outcomes that define that class of students? And then we could work backwards in time and actually start with the 8th grade. What do we need to see? What are outcomes in the 8th grade that we need to contribute to the ones that actually feed the Sauhegan graduate path? And then what are the 4th grade ones? You can do it grade by grade, but we just chose every 4 grades as a break point. And so that gives us some tangible goals that we can try to achieve and some ways of working backwards in time to figure out if there's appropriate measurements and outcomes that get us there.
Okay. Well, I also appreciate being asked to collaborate and weigh in on some of this stuff too. And I've already told Peter that if there's any way I can help in any of this going forward, I'm quite willing to do that. And good luck.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, the next thing on the agenda is
So-
the,
Can we talk about what just happened and how we want to, whether we want to go forward, and if we do, how? I know it's getting late, but I think, for me, I think this is really important work, and I think we all need to decide if we want to do this, and if we do, start to have a conversation about how we want to move forward.
I was holding off a little bit because we have the next item, which is talking about adding a SAU board meeting on Thursday, the 23rd of February, which is going to connect with what you're saying, Amy. I can say that our leadership team love the frameworks, really. It's helping all of us to look at this in a whole different way. We were kind of struggling with that, and having somebody come in and give us a different look has really helped us. I would say Mike is offering his expertise, already has. I think it could help where we need to get to in a lot of ways. So I appreciate the help for sure. And I think this has kind of reignited some thinking about the plan, dashboards, other kinds of things. So that's, I think, and I don't want to speak for the team, but I'd say we're pretty much that way and ready to go forward and have the conversations. I know it's late, and I don't want to shut down what you're saying, Amy, and I'm thinking if we go ahead and have a February 23rd board meeting, we would be scheduling it around 2 things: outcomes, and my favorite, policy work that I talk about all the time now. So really schedule it that way, 2 hours. But this is, as Mike says, a lot of work. And the other part we didn't do from last time was talk about vision. So in conversations, we wanted to try and use our time with getting this out there, because if you notice, vision is a piece that we really need to talk about. There are some people that met recently that talked about a high school graduate, vision, and I know some people here tonight might want to talk about that, and maybe some further conversation about what you were asking about. Amy.
So would this be a workshop, perhaps, at our next meeting? So that
yeah, I don't think there was if we should go forward with this. We invested a lot of time and energy going this route.
Yep.
I think the question should be, what is our next step? And I think a workshop would really play into that a lot.
Yeah.
I agree. It's going to help us turn the corner.
My only question is on that date. Is that the week of spring break?
No.
It's a week right before.
Okay.
It'll be the Thursday before.
No, because the
I know I
following
can't
week
make
I'll be
that
in
day.
Florida, and I know there's no school that week.
I'll be down there with you.
Good.
Can we just get a sense, Howard, like a straw poll on what people think here, just quick, I want to make sure everybody's good, like, this.
I'm good at, show of hands, who's available on the 23rd?
Available or
23rd, is that what you
interested?
said?
Or both.
Yes. Everybody good with that?
There was only a few that didn't.
Yeah, I can't be there.
Oh, you'll be in Florida too?
Not yet.
All right.
Also moving forward with the work, right? I mean, we're
Yeah.
kind of game for that. Great.
All right. And Mike, will you join us that night?
I'll look at my schedule.
Okay.
I might
We'd
be
appreciate your help.
If I can, I will.
All right, so we'll put that on the agenda for the 23rd of February. Next item is the default budget.
Just, Peter had mentioned that, there's some pillar groups or, committees that board members sit on that have discussed and we're ready to talk about the visions of a graduate and stuff like that. Is that going to be able to happen tonight, Peter, or?
I thought, part of the agenda talked a little bit about that, because I knew that was discussed at the grading and reporting
Right.
committee, and I know some people there that wanted to talk a little bit about that. That can happen tonight, or we can also have that as an opener for the 23rd. I'd hate to just like have it and then nothing happen with it, you know what I mean? So if people are okay, we could bring that up as the beginning of the 23rd meeting, if people are okay with that, and go from there.
My only concern, Unite's actually been meeting, and we've got a rough draft. We're supposed to meet on Tuesday to kind of finalize, but snow. Because part of the responsibilities of Unite was loss of not necessarily vision, maybe philosophy is the word. My mind keeps forgetting what that word is, but I can talk to Sarah and have her present that in my place, because I'm not going to be here that day.
My only question is when this whole idea of a vision came up, not to always point to that guy sitting to the right of David there, but when we had the discussion about going to a single SAU, one of the complaints was that, well, we didn't even have a vision, we didn't even know what a graduate would look like, so if we were going to do anything to talk about that tonight, then it might have been worthwhile. That was the only reason. I thought that was part of why we were going to have this meeting. But if we're not going to go down that path, then you're right. Holding it off until we do the planning part.
Vision's still on our list, okay? We're just maybe escaping that work just for a little while, but it's still on our list for sure.
And I do believe that ties in with the rest of the stuff that we're going to be doing.
I agree.
Sorry.
Jim?
Just to answer your question, I think that the conversations with Mike, vision's so hard, especially for a group of 17 people. It made a lot of sense to say, let's take a stab at outcomes first, because once you start to see the outcomes, it does start to give you a sense for, okay, if we're driving in this direction, then what, we're such a big group, it helps to get us to vision by kind of going, I don't want to say backwards, but backwards from what I've done, how I've done it before.
We have to decide what we value,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. And that was the conversation I had with Mike as well. Just kind of, let's get this, and then let's, but get to the vision at some point of a graduate. I think the timing will be better, and the discussion, I think, will be healthier.
Okay. All right, the default budget clarification and preparation. Adam?
Yeah, thank you. Included in your packet is a letter from the School District Council regarding the default budget. One of the boards, and honestly, I have to get which one, publicly asked for an opinion from legal counsel regarding this topic. So this letter is not privileged communication, so we were able to release it to the board and to the public. I don't think there's a need for discussion tonight, as it really affects our ongoing things. I can tell you that overall budget development process for FY19 is going to look a lot different, and we're going to want to have that conversation with the various school boards shortly after the March election to map out what the process looks like and to better define roles and responsibilities in different process points along the way. One of which will be the default budget calculation and the inclusion, at least our recommendation to include the various budget committees in that process along the way. So this is merely a response from the request from the board to get a legal opinion, and it can guide our discussion moving forward.
Thanks for putting this together so quickly, Adam. I know that we talked about making a decision in April, May, and this is a big help. So
No problem.
to have this information earlier is better. So, thanks.
No problem. All right, so now we move on to others, and the superintendent has a few things.
Very quickly, if you are interested in going to the comedy night for robotics, on Saturday night, I have tickets here if anybody wants any.
It's a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun.
It is fun.
These are complimentary tickets, right? But I would throw, well, they were given to me as complimentary tickets.
But you're going to
Perfect timing.
You're in charge.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
The other thing is, you may have received this communication from the Hampshire School Boards Association, that if you have children, there's a scholarship for those people, and if you're in that vein, if you have children that are going into college next year, there is a small scholarship that you can apply for as a board member, okay? The only other thing is, a lot of things happened tonight. I thank you for your patience with the on-air group. I think it's going to be a lot of fun as we create that magazine with them and we create our dashboards. Another really good thing that's happened over the past couple of days is that a former student from Mount Vernon, who was in my advisory 4 years ago, is graduating from Syracuse in media and is willing to help us with the magazine free of charge. And thanks to Tom Driscoll, I'm going to be Skyping with her tomorrow. So Tom was a big piece of that. So we've got some help there. The on-air group is doing some great stuff. Rob Scully is going to get an Academy Award probably very soon because he does have an acting talent, doesn't he? So thank you for that. You'll be hearing more about that. And we'll continue on with what we saw tonight. I want to thank Mike. I want to thank Meg for her presentation. Both not easy things to present. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
And thank you for standing up there and taking your picture.
Yeah.
I'll like a motion.
Move to adjourn.
Second. Vote. Aye. We are adjourned.